So hi, welcome to this episode of History Hunters. I'm at Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery in San Diego, and there are over 50,000 people, men and women, who served our country during times of war who are buried here at this hallowed ground. I'm just impressed by the sheer number of graves on both sides of the road coming in. This is the road to the Cabrillo Monument, where Spanish explorer Juan Cabrillo landed here. He was the first European to set foot on the west coast of the United States. Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery burial ground. Before 1847, this graveyard became an Army post cemetery in the 1860s. It's the final resting place for most who fell at San Pasqual in 1846, and for the USS Bennington, victims of 1905. It became Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery in 1934 and was placed under the Veterans Administration National Cemetery System in 1973. Over 50,000 who served the U.S. honorably in war and peace lie here. I thought it was interesting that this Leon Leroy was a private first class in World War II, right next to Leonard Warner, who was in Company G, 1st Regiment of Nebraska Infantry during the Spanish-American War. He lived from 1880 to 1959. Next to the widow, and she died in 1988, all next to each other. Thousands of graves, military personnel and their spouses, and it just covers all this beautiful ground here overlooking the Pacific Ocean. We are in Point Loma Peninsula, San Diego, and just are amazed at all the people who served our country at one time or the other, various wars. And we're going to try to find some historically significant people. So right here is a Harry Roberts, the Spanish-American War. As you can see, he lived from 1874 to 1959.
World War II, Korea, Vietnam. Philip William Crandall.
He certainly did his part. Philip William Crandall served in the Navy for World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Died in 1982.
This was a Marine for all three of those.
There's a bunch of monuments here for lost servicemen. This is for those who lost their lives on the Wasp, USS Wasp. The USS Wasp, designated CV-7, was a U.S. Navy aircraft carrier commissioned in 1940, but was hit by enemy torpedoes during World War II. The Wasp was situated in the Pacific in June 1942 to replace losses at the battles of Coral Sea and Midway. After supporting the invasion of Guadalcanal, the Wasp was hit by 3 torpedoes from a Japanese submarine on September 15, 1942. The resulting damage set off several explosions and fires. She was abandoned and scuttled by torpedoes fired from the USS Lansdowne later that evening. A total of 193 men had died, and 366 were wounded in the attack. I'm specifically interested in finding the grave of Major General Joseph Pendleton, for which Camp Pendleton in Southern California is named. He's buried over in this section over here. There's certainly a lot of graves here. Some are bigger than the others. So it took a little digging. I had to go to the office to ask, but you enter this section here. Sarah's parked way over there, and you come over this area here, the OFF section. I understand maybe that stands for officers. And right here, marked 191, and somebody has placed a penny on top of his grave, is Joseph Henry Pendleton of California, Major General, U.S. Marine Corps. February 4th, 1942, he passed away. This is the gentleman for whom Camp Pendleton in Southern California is named, just north of San Diego. Pendleton served in the Marine Corps for over 40 years. He graduated from the Naval Academy in 1884, but later transferred to the Marines and served around the globe, including Alaska, the Philippines, Guam, Cuba, and Europe. Between 1898 and 1934, the U.S. was involved in a number of skirmishes known as the Banana Wars to protect American interests in Central America. At the outbreak of the Spanish-American War in 1898, Pendleton took part in the bombardment of Santiago, Cuba, and is credited with firing the last shot in that engagement. During the battle, Pendleton suffered eye damage from the concussions of the big guns. 5 years later, a board of officers ironically unsuccessfully tried to force him to retire early because of his eyesight. Pendleton had a vision, however, that would change San Diego's future. In 1914, he suggested that the opening of the Panama Canal created the need for a permanent Marine Corps training base in San Diego. He cited its good weather, strategic location next to Mexico, and the harbor itself. The 1915 Panama, California exposition held in Balboa Park gave him a chance to parade around his Marines in front of influential politicians and dignitaries. After the expo was over, some of the buildings were converted to temporary Marine barracks. Pendleton's idea eventually produced the Marine Corps Recruit Depot in March 1919. His legacy continued with other bases and training camps, including the Miramar Marine Corps Air Station. When Pendleton retired in 1924, he was just 64 and made his home in Coronado, where he briefly served as mayor from 1928 to 1930. He passed away at his home at age 81 on February 4, 1942. 2 months later, the Marine Corps began construction of a large base north of Oceanside. The obvious choice of a name was Pendleton, who had long advocated for a major Marine Corps installation on the West Coast. On September 25, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt helped to dedicate Camp Joseph H. Pendleton with his widow Mary Pendleton present. The Marines who trained on bases he helped to establish fought in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Mrs. Pendleton, the former Mary Helen Fay, passed away in Coronado on June 26, 1952, at the age of 88. You can always tell if there's somebody important or significant when you see money on their grave, and I was hoping to find this grave. Is that of Major Mason Carter of the U.S. Army, 1834 to 1909, and his loving wife Lucy lived from 1850 to 1938. During the American Civil War, Carter was wounded at the Battle of Wilson's Creek on August 10, 1861. He then spent 20 years on the Indian frontiers. During the Black Hills War, he was involved in skirmishes against Sitting Bull in 1876 and Crazy Horse in June 1877. On September 30, 1877, Carter commanded a force that had surrounded a camp of Nez Perce Indians. When a fellow officer was wounded during the Battle of Bear Paw, Carter led a charge under heavy fire and inflicted heavy casualties against the Indians. A third of his command was wiped out within the 30-minute fight. The engagement was one of the bloodiest and most fiercely fought battles against the Indians and resulted in the surrender of Chief Joseph and his band of Nez Perce to General Nelson Miles. For leading the charge under galling fire, Carter received the Medal of Honor for heroism on September 30, 1877 at Bear Paw Mountain, Montana. He holds a distinction as being the first Medal of Honor recipient to be interred at Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery. Here's Nat Pfister, Lieutenant Colonel, 30th U.S. Infantry, class of 1878. He lived until 1911. So here's an interesting grave. The line of duty, Edward Lewis Jr. Killed in the line of duty, Edward Lewis Jr., Lieutenant Air Service, U.S. Army, born New York, April 18th, 1890. Killed at Brooks Field in Texas on June 8th, 1925. It says Searle here. Maybe it's Edward Lewis Searle Jr. Look at that old insignia right there. Very cool. Lieutenant Frank Bruce, U.S. Navy, killed while in command of the USS Bobolink, May 14th, 1919. Erected by his corps mates. A lot of tragedy here, a lot of war tragedy here, reflected in these graves. William Reynolds Cushman, Lieutenant Commander, U.S. Navy. I think he died August 27th, 1919. Cecil Connolly, Lieutenant Air Service, September 11th, 1919. I have a feeling these were all air crashes. Here's a death in San Diego, 1920. Gunner Charles Francis Hilaire. Barron, Lieutenant Louis Barron. He was killed in a line of duty at the U.S. Naval Air Station, San Diego, June 1920. So this monument here, this very tall monument, is a monument, as you can see, to the dead of the Bennington, USS Bennington, July 21st, 1905. This ship had a tremendous accident. It was a boiler explosion. So on the morning of July 21st, 1905, the crew of the ship was preparing her sail to aid the Monitor, Wyoming, which had broken down with need of a tow after her crew had finished the difficult task of coiling the ship that morning. Most of them were below deck, cleaning themselves for the dirty job. Unbeknownst to anyone on board, 3 problems of the boilers: oily feed water, an improperly closed steam valve, and a faulty steam gauge were conspiring against them. About 10:30, the pressure in the system caused the boiler to explode, rocked the entire ship, sending men and equipment flying into the air. The escaping steam sprang through the living compartments and the decks. The explosion opened the hull to the sea, and she began to take water. The sad truth is that a lot of these men here were basically boiled alive. It was one of the U.S. Navy's worst peacetime disasters. Nearly all of the 46 who survived had an injury of some sort. The death toll was 1 officer and 65 men. And they're all buried here. Collective grave here. Bronson, who's the cook. Takata, U.S. Navy. Chief Captain's mate. These are the victims of the Bennington. Here's First Sergeant Henry Jones of the Marine Corps. He died October 8th, 1918, killed in action in the Battle of Champagne in Mont Blanc, France. And his wife, Inez, who died much later in 1968. So this obelisk here caught my attention, and I found some interesting information about who's buried here. It's of Charles Ivan Aller, A-L-L-E-R. He was killed in the dirigible disaster.
The ZR-2 dirigible, an R-38 class airship, was in flight over Hull, England on August 24, 1921, when it suffered a structural failure and crashed into the Humber estuary, killing 44 of the 49 crew members aboard. At the time, it was the world's largest airship. Its destruction was the first of the great airship disasters. Today, a memorial in the Western Cemetery of Hull commemorates the lives that were lost.
He was just 33 years old, but they set up this very nice obelisk marker for him that is very prominent on this section. As you can see, San Diego, beautiful San Diego, off in the distance with the bay way out there. Even as I'm here, I can hear a helicopter down there. Wally Schirra, the famous astronaut, has a cenotaph right here. It is not where he's buried, unfortunately. His ashes were dumped at sea. Wally Schirra was one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts chosen for the Mercury project, the U.S. first effort to put men in space, and he was the only man to fly in America's first 3 space programs, the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. He logged in over 300 hours and 15 minutes in space. Now, while his remains are not here, they do overlook the Pacific Ocean out there, which is exactly where Wally Schirra's ashes ended up. Now, while it's true that Wally Schirra did fly on one Apollo mission, in fact, he circled the Earth for 3 days just to get the bugs worked out of the Apollo system so that they could actually ultimately send men to the moon for Apollo 11, Wally Schirra was instrumental in getting that program off the ground. I remember watching the moon landing in 1969, July 20th to be exact, and he was there with Walter Cronkite in the studio. I remember how he got excited about Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landing on the moon. In fact, the moment that it happened, I think he was choking back the tears and wiping them from his face.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
Oh, boy.
Thank you. You're looking good here.
So that was a pretty cool moment that I remember as a kid. So as I wrap up this visit to Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery, I want to just ask you to remember that freedom isn't free. A lot of these men paid the ultimate price just so that we could have a free country and democracy throughout the world. It seems like democracy is always under attack. And I want to thank you very much for joining us on this episode of History Hunters.